Hello, welcome to The Raven and the Writing Desk. I'm your host, Chris Lester, the creator of the Metamor City story universe. You can find my work at chrislester.org and metamorcity.com. I am here in the virtual studio today with author Nobilis Reed. Nobilis is the host of Nobilis Erotica, which is the longest running erotica podcast in the history of the world. He is also
the known universe, I like to say.
He has also published 2 novels, several novellas, numerous short stories, including quite a few set in the world of Metamor City. His new book is called The Monster Whisperer, and it will be released by Circlet Press on December 8th, 2016. Welcome to the show, Nobilis.
Thank you for having me.
So I want to start out by having you talk to us about how this story got started and came to be. Tell us a little bit about the story and what the genesis of it was.
Well, okay. Well, first off, let's start with what it is. Monster Whisperer is a novel about Dale Clearwater, who is a traveling reality show / porn star who keeps tentacle monsters and advises people who keep tentacle monsters. She was always intended as a parody of the Dog Whisperer program from a while back. And it was started off just as a what if of what if tentacle sex were generally considered a consensual thing rather than something that happened as a result of an attack. I'm not the first person to think of this. The phrase consenticle has been out in the erotica parlance for a while, but as is very common with me with erotica, my thinking starts to go to, well, what kind of person would be interested in this, and what kind of world would they live in, and so that sort of thing blows past the concept of a vignette pretty quickly, and it started off as a short story. Podcasted it, and it was fairly popular. And at the time, I wanted to have a bonus for folks who were going to buy the brand new or fairly new Android and iPhone apps for my podcast. I wanted something that only the people who bought it could get access to. So I started putting episodes of that as a serial in the app. So it had a very limited release to just those people at the time. And then it went along, and the serial came to a fairly nice conclusion. And then I went back to the manuscript, and I found that it was well over 50,000 words that I'd written for this thing that started off as just kind of a whim. I said, this is really kind of a novel. I should do something with that. And so now the submissions process for novels at Circlet Press is a kind of unusual one, in that they don't have a single submissions editor. They have a number of assistant editors, and you need to submit it to one of them in order to get them to sign up to be the editor for that novel. And a good friend of mine, Bliss Morgan, who I've been working with on the podcast lately, doing some narration and things like that, read it, thought it was absolutely marvelous, and agreed to be the editor for it. And that's how I got published at Circlet Press. So that's how it started, and that's how we got to where we are now.
Excellent. Now, you've had a long and productive partnership with Circlet Press. They've sponsored many episodes of Nobilis Erotica, and you're a regular contributor in their anthologies. How did that relationship start, and what is it about working with them that keeps you coming back?
Well, I discovered Circlet Press quite a few years ago in a call for submissions that came up through my usual connections to look for call for submissions. And I wrote a story for it, and it was accepted. And another call for submissions came up, and I wrote a story for it, and it got accepted. And I wrote another story for another call, and it got accepted. And I said, you know what? 3 for 3 on acceptances on it. It indicates that there's a certain congruence of taste going on there. And of course I got copies of those anthologies when when they were published, and they were great, and the stories in them were great. And so I proposed to Cecilia Tan, the editor-in-chief at Circlet Press, that it would be great to get some Circlet stories into the podcast, and maybe we could set up a sponsorship deal. So for the past, I don't know, 2.5, 3 years, something like, Circlet Press has sponsored one episode a month, and they basically give me the rights to that, to one story from one of their anthologies as part of that sponsorship deal. And then I get someone to narrate it, or I narrate it myself and put it in the podcast. And I've gotten some really incredible stories through that deal. I got one of the more recent ones I got was A Dancer's War by N.K. Jemisin.
Yeah, I saw that one. That was very cool.
Yeah, it's a brilliant story. I am so proud to have a Hugo-winning author on my podcast. I think actually I may change it so that, I talk about the longest running. No, longest running is nothing. You can make, 10 years of, anybody can make 10 years of crap. I have the only erotica podcast in the known universe that has a Hugo Award-winning author in it. So
awesome. Very cool. So this book is about tentacle monsters. As some of our listeners may already know, this is a trope that has been around for a long time in Japan, but it really took off in anime in order to get around the Japanese censorship laws. So it's always fascinated me that something that was so specific to one culture was able to cross over to the West and appeal to a completely different audience. So in light of that, I'll ask you, why tentacle monsters? What is this fantasy about?
Okay. Monster Whisperer is not my first dip into the tentacle sex arena. Some years back, a friend of mine, who you may have heard of, Remittance Girl, she's a fairly well-known erotica author, who writes a lot of kind of edgy stuff, decided to do an anthology of tentacle sex stories. And about halfway through the submissions process, for whatever reason, she decided she didn't want to edit it anymore. And I volunteered to pick up after her. So she sent me her slush pile and said, all right, fine, you do it. Or maybe it wasn't that dismissive. I don't know. The point was she handed the reins over to me, and I picked out 6 or 8 stories that I thought were good. And we published Tentacle Dreams, which unfortunately the publisher of went under, and so is no longer available. All the rights reverted on the stories, and that went away. And I felt that was kind of a shame that the story went away. So I went to another publisher that I work with on a fairly regular basis, Coming Together, which is a charity erotica series, and said, hey, I'd like to do a tentacle sex anthology for Coming Together. And she said, sure. And so I put out a new call for submissions, got a bunch of new stories. I got a huge number of great stories with all different kinds of things in it. And we made Coming Together Arm in Arm in Arm, which
I love that title.
It's a charity anthology which is still available, still in print, which benefits Oceana, which is an ocean research charity.
Yes.
And in fact, that anthology got my first mention in IO9. And so I've been, kind of interested in that ever since that time. But I think the appeal, as I wrote in the preface of Arm in Arm in Arm, is that a tentacle monster represents just irresistible, undeniable, lustful intent. That there is no when you're in the arms of a tentacle monster, there's no worry about what you look like or who you are. It wants you. It wants you now. It doesn't care about anything except having you. And I think that for some people, that feeling of being just swept up in something that whose attention is absolutely and completely focused on you is a very powerful fantasy.
It's sort of a
Um,
ravishment kind of a thing.
yeah. Though I think that when you get into the consentical side of things, it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be ravishment. It can be just its overpowering force. And yeah, and one of the tropes of monster whisperers, I kind of flip around the advice given to someone who's handling a dog, which is, stay calm, stay in control, stay focused, and the dog will behave. That when you're dealing with a tentacle monster, the thing to do is to just, absolutely let go of control, be afraid, be excited, be, as emotional as you care to be, because that's what the tentacle monster craves, is your emotional release. And so that, it's kind of as a way to almost legitimize those feelings of just letting go of everything.
There's an interesting metaphor there too about um, I'm trying to figure out how to put this into words, but in our culture, there for a long time was a sense of women should participate in sex when men want it, but they shouldn't act like they're enjoying it too much. Like there was almost a shamefulness in a woman wanting to have sex and enjoying sex and really being an enthusiastic participant in it.
Well,
And
I think that that's definitely part of it for some people. And I try not to gender my feelings about this, because
mhm,
certainly the when I did Arm in Arm in Arm, a significant number of the humans who were uh, 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 in the scenes were male. So
mm,
I don't want to say that that's necessarily, especially nowadays, really specific to women. I think anybody can feel a certain amount of liberation from from feeling like you're in the arms of something more powerful than
oh,
you.
certainly. And I wasn't intending that as a I was more speaking to like the cultural expectations being
Yeah,
different for men and women.
yeah. I mean, I recognize that that's true, but I try not to bring that too strongly. I mean, the main character of Monster Whisperer is a woman.
Hmm.
Um, and most of the people who she comes in contact with are women. And so to some extent that, I'm kind of accepting that that's what people expect the people who are interested in tentacle monsters to be.
Hmm.
Um, but at the same time, I don't want to. And another thing that I did with Monster Whisperer is I made every character that whose gender didn't really need to be decided upon, didn't need to be one way or the other. I made them all female.
Hmm.
So there's like two significant male characters there. Well, there's three. There's three significant male characters in the story, and one of them is only male because he's PG Holyfield. So that would have been another woman if that had not been for a need to put PG Holyfield into the story at that point.
There was an homage there, huh?
Yes, yes. Mm-hmm.
So let's
Yes,
talk.
he's the.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Let's talk about consent and erotica. I know this is a big thing for you, and the characters in many of your stories do an excellent job of communicating with each other during sex and modeling consent, communicating
Mm-hmm.
even before and after sex as well. Um, so, how do you approach the consent question when you have creatures that most people would look at and say, oh, that's just an animal? What challenges did that bring up for you, and how did you address
That is
them?
actually a significant theme of the entire book. Um, at the beginning of the story, um, uh, keeping tentacle monsters is a kind of a shady business. There are planets where it's simply forbidden entirely, and there are also planets where it's not respectable, but people kind of do it. And a lot of the businesses associated with it have got connections to the underground and stuff like that. It's kind of a gray market deal, because while Dale is convinced that tentacle monsters are sentient because of the way they behave, nobody can actually communicate with them with anything approaching language. They can be trained to respond to certain stimuli, and understandings of a sort can be reached, but the relationship is still a bit more like the keeping of a pet than a partnership understanding. And even for Dale, that's something that comes up. Now she's convinced that there's nothing wrong with it, of course.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that whole, what are tentacle monsters thing is throughout the book, and to say too much more would start being spoilery.
Fair enough. This kind of connects to my next question, which is, fiction writers write about lots of behaviors that are, shall we say, problematic. We regularly have characters in our stories who lie, who cheat, who steal, who even kill. But most people would not look at us as authors and say, oh, because you wrote a character performing such and such an action, it must mean you condone that action. But with sex, it's different. Every time we write something erotic, it seems like somebody's going to judge our personal character by what our fictional characters get up to. Why do you think that double standard exists, and what do you do about it, if anything?
Well, to be honest, I have not encountered a great deal of this myself. I hear it from a lot of my colleagues who are women, that they'll talk about people assuming that they've done the things that they've written about in their stories, that they're interested in personally doing the things that they're interested in, the things that they describe in their stories. And yeah, it's a double standard. You don't ask a mystery writer if they've killed someone, but at the same time, I think that's not the actual surface of the issue. I think that there's an undercurrent of that. When somebody asks that kind of question, they're expressing a desire on their own part for that, and it's not a desire that they feel comfortable expressing. So it gets sublimated and transferred and all those other psychological terms into something else before it can be expressed. So I think that those kinds of questions and those kinds of suspicions say much more about the person asking the question than it does anything else.
So have you ever chosen not to write something because of how you thought it might be received?
I have chosen not to write things because of the way it would affect me to write it.
Interesting. Say more about that.
Well, I've got a story about a man who's in an auto accident. And before the accident, he is he's just kind of a normal guy. He's upper class. He owns a business. He runs a business. We see him in the course of that first chapter running that business in a very ethical way. He's about to fire somebody who's been sexually harassing some of the employees, and he's about to fire this person in spite of the fact that he's a very successful salesman at the company. He's saying, nope, this is not acceptable. I don't care how much money you make for us, you're gone. And then he has this auto accident, and afterwards he starts hearing voices in his head that want him to do some really terrible things. And I thought this would be kind of an interesting way of approaching, someone whose sexual desires are forbidden, and forbidden for really good reasons. And I started to write this, and I thought this was a really great idea, but the cost to me to write this thing is going to be too high. It's just going to be that hard to do. If I took like 6 months off from doing the podcast and just focused on it, I could probably get through it and do it and possibly make something really great. But it was just too much for me personally. So the consequences were personal, not cultural or social. I don't think I think that the cost to me in that sense would be greater than anything that I could suffer for having published that story. Aside from that, yeah, if the idea is good and I think it's, and I think, and I managed to finish the story, yeah, I don't generally worry too much about whether or not anybody else is going to get on my case for it. Mainly because I don't think I'm really that well known enough to among those sorts of people to generate much in the way of controversy. I mean, quite frankly, there's a story from the early days of Rocky and Bullwinkle. You remember that cartoon from before both of us were born. And I remember really hearing an interview with one of the guys behind it. I think one of the writers, and they included this artifact that, a MacGuffin that Rocky and Bullwinkle and Boris and Natasha were going after, called the Kerwood Derby, which would, if you wore it, you became tremendously intelligent. And the Kerwood Derby was a play on the name of an actor of the time named Durwood Kirby. And Durwood Kirby's attorneys came to them and said, "You can't do this, we'll sue." And the producers of Rocky and Bullwinkle, which was always on this tremendous shoestring, said, sue us, we don't have any money, and we'd love the publicity.
Yes.
So, I mean, now the nature of social media being what it is, it would not be fun to be the target of a social media campaign, certainly. But I don't think it would necessarily be 100% a bad thing, especially if it wasn't particularly well justified.
Right.
But at the same time, I just wrote a short essay a little while ago about writing when I'm a homeowning, able-bodied, cisgender male in a stable relationship. I'm got a lot of privilege.
Right.
Right. And if I address issues of social justice, I am entering a minefield, because I can very easily get it wrong, first of all, and hurt people.
Sure. Yeah.
And even if I go to the great lengths required to get it right, I'm still in a position where I can be elbowing aside somebody who those issues affect directly rather than indirectly, who could tell it better and make a profit by doing so.
Right.
So on the one hand, going after these social justice issues is a minefield. On the other hand, writing something that ignores those issues is no better. Right? So no matter what I do, whether I write about these issues or write about some other things, I'm entering into an arena where anything I do can be criticized.
Right. This is true.
And in fact, anything I do can be criticized, probably with good reason. The only safe thing is to not write, which, quite frankly, I don't think that the safe version is always the safe thing to do is necessarily the right thing to do. But the ability to go into a situation with the confidence that if I go in with best intentions, then I will be able to escape any criticism is itself an aspect of privilege. Only privileged people can do that.
It's true. It's true.
Okay. So if I go in and I get criticized, well, that is the price of being of entering a space and being creative and making things. That is one of the things that can happen. And if I go in and I'm criticized and it's valid, I will answer it. And if I go in and I'm criticized and I don't necessarily think it is, then maybe I won't adjust my behavior. But I'm remaining silent is not for me an option. So
Right.
I put issues into my books because I think that they belong there. I know that I'm probably not going to change the world with even all of my books taken together. Is probably not going to have that much impact all by myself. But I think that not trying is worse.
That is really profound, and these are issues that I've been wrestling with too. I've spent a lot of time over the last few years thinking about how I want to address issues of justice in my writing, and and what my standing is to do so. And definitely a faction within the left that would prefer that people just err on the side of self-censorship, and I think that that's the death of intellectual freedom and the death of public discourse. So all that to say, I appreciate what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, there is no simple answer. Well, the simple answer is, if you want simple answers, then don't write things, because there's, and once you step outside that circle and start creating things, the answers are no longer simple.
I saw there was a blog post, I think it was last year, where somebody had mentioned that a member of the activist group that they were a part of had said, kind of in exasperation, everything is problematic. And I heard that and I was like, yeah, actually, just, put that up on a billboard, because that is universally true. Everything is problematic.
You look at something from the right point of view, you will find something problematic in it. And the important thing to do is to recognize what those things are and talk about them, rather than throw up your hands and say, well, since everything is all problematic, I'll just do what I like.
Right.
Yeah.
But the solution to problematic speech is not restrictions on speech.
Silence.
It's more speech.
Yeah. Yes. Exactly.
So let's look at the business side of things. What advice would you give to somebody who's looking to get into the erotica market? Are there market expectations about how much sex you include in a story, where it gets included, etc., etc.?
If you're writing erotic romance, the publishers have what they call heat levels, with various different things, but it's usually like a 5-point scale, with a 5 being, okay, there's going to be sex in every chapter, and 1 being quote unquote cozy, where nobody has any physical contact until the wedding night. And then it fades to black. And everything in between is like covered. You can find a publisher somewhere that specializes in that particular level. There's no right answer. But one of the things that happens in erotica a great deal is that people tend to have very specific tastes. They want to see this thing in it, and if it's not there, they're kind of not interested.
Yep.
Now, there's a book out there called Perv, by, let me look up quickly who wrote it, because it's a great book, and I listened to the audiobook and it's fabulous. It's the Perv, the Sexual Deviant in All of Us, by Jesse Bering, Bering, like the straight. Interesting, because he's not. And it goes through some of the major things that have been considered perversion over the years, like homosexuality and fetishism and BDSM and things like that, and talks about the history of when they were acceptable and when they weren't and why and all that kind of stuff. But it also goes through certain things about human psychosocial development and sexual development. And one of the things that seems to be, as far as anyone can tell, and of course the research on this is a little thinner on the ground than anyone would like, but nevertheless, it seems to be that men will get their kind of sexual hooks set up by about the age of 13. And after that, that's what they want, and the one thing that they want for the rest of their lives. What kind of partner they like, what kind of body on that partner they like, what kind of things they like to do and think about, and any fetishes and stuff like that are, generally speaking, set at that point for like 90% of men and about 10% of women. And women seem to have a much more fluid sexuality for a longer period of time. Again, this might not be actual truth. It's the best that the science can give us right now. And of course, getting money for sex research is really hard.
It's so hard.
But and I think this is because there's such a wide variety of stuff that I do in my podcast. This is why I think most of my listeners tend to be women, is because that they're more open to all these different things. And I've now completely forgotten what your question was.
Market expectations and advice for people looking to break in.
Right. So if you're the kind of author who likes to write about the same thing over and over again, and you're going to be like Chuck Tingle, for example, you pretty much know what a Chuck Tingle book is going to have in it, right?
It's exactly what it says in the tin.
Exactly what it says in the tin. I think that because publishers are usually not interested in these really narrow niche markets, right? If you want to be that kind of author with a really narrow niche market, and the thing about really narrow niche markets is once someone who likes your stuff finds you, they buy everything that you have.
Yes.
So it's great to have something like that where you feel completely comfortable writing the same sort of things with small variations over and over again. There's nothing wrong with that. Then self-publishing is really your deal, because that's where that stuff lives.
Yeah.
There have been a few publishers, small press type places that have tried to exploit that, but the margins are never good enough for them to stay open. So, and you could be the next Chuck Tingle if you find the right thing. The women who write the dinosaur porn.
Yes.
They're self-publishers as well. And these are two that we've heard of, but there's hundreds of them on the Kindles and Smashwords and places like that. If your tastes are a little more varied and you like the short story format, then submitting to anthologies is the best way to get get something for your work. Most of the erotica published these days is in the form of short story anthologies, I think, because most of the time that's the format that best suits erotica. Novels are a little less common. That's not to say that there aren't some brilliant erotic novels out there, but it's a little harder to sustain something in a novel form.
Insert joke here about stamina.
Yeah, I was trying to think of one. I just couldn't put it together. And there's a lot of places that put out calls for submission for erotica. They don't generally pay terribly much, usually $25, $50 for a short story, which is works out to maybe a penny a word if you're lucky. But there are some that pay more, and at the top end there are some pro markets in the erotica field. But the vast majority of the publishers that are publishing longer works, novellas and novels, it's erotic romance. And at that point, there's a different kind of formula you're going for there. So yeah, that's my advice. It really depends on whether you like to branch out and try a lot of different things, or if you're really heavily focused.
And that does lead to my next question, which is that I've noticed over the last 20 years, there's been a rise of authors like Jacqueline Carey and Laurel K. Hamilton, who are including a lot more explicit and semi-explicit sex that's just showing up on the mainstream fantasy shelves.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the difference, do you think, between fantastic erotica and just fantasy that has a lot of sex in it?
Well, here's something that I would like to point out. Jacqueline Carey is one that people bring out a lot because of the explicit sex. And when I finished the first story, Korshiel's Dart, I actually sent off to her to ask her if I could put an excerpt of Korshiel's Dart in my podcast.
I remember that excerpt.
And she said, fine, which one do you want to use? And I went back to the story, and there's actually only 3 explicit sex scenes in that really long novel. There's a number of them that are fairly low key, but there's only 3 that are really, really explicitly laid out. So it seemed, because the characters are so sensual, and because the culture is so sensual, we think of it as a really tremendously sexual book. But in point of fact, it's not. We can go back to the 90s and the 80s and the 70s and the 60s and find novels that had as much sex as Korshiel's Dart did that were also mainstream novels. So I disagree with the concept that things have gotten to that stage.
It's just our perception of it that's changed.
It's your perception, yes. And there's a commonality to think that your current age is more corrupt than previous, and it can come up in lots of different ways.
Yes.
I just finished reading Charles Stross, Saturn's Children, I think it's called. Mm-hmm. And the main character is a sex robot. She's a sex robot in a culture where humanity has been extinct for hundreds of years. And so her primary purpose for existing is gone. And because of how she's programmed and how she's built, she sees everything in a sexual context. But they're all different kinds, and so the book is really sexy, but it doesn't have any explicit sex in it to speak of, because there's nobody for her to have sex with, which is kind of not true, and I don't want to spoil. I think that there is a distinction between fantastic erotica and fantasy that has lots of sex, or fantasy that has sex in it, and science fiction that has sex in it. Because if it is science fiction erotica, it is science fiction that is about sex. Erotica is more, especially in science fiction and fantasy, erotica is more than just how much sex is in it. It's also how you address it. It's how important it is to the story and the lives of the characters. there's Difference Engine by William Gibson has this scene smack in the middle of the book where the main character leaves London, visits a prostitute. There's an explicit sex scene. He spends a few pages staring out the prostitute's window back at the city, musing on the state of the city, and then he goes back and continues his adventures. The sex scene is absolutely and completely disjointed from the rest of the novel. I feel very certain that the editor went to him and says, there's no sex in this book. And he said, well, it doesn't need any. And they said, put some sex in the book. So he said, sure. He just kind of opened his manuscript at random, shoved in a sex scene and sent it back because it really feels like that.
Oy.
It may be erotic because the scene was well written. I mean, it's William Gibson, but it still had really no place in the novel. It didn't address anything. It was not addressed by anything. It was just there. And so that, and that's a flaw in itself. I mean, you don't want to write any scene that doesn't have a place.
Right.
But what it really depends on is how close to the heart of the story the sex is. That really is really the difference for me. And it's not a well delineated border. I mean, I think there's a lot of stuff out there that really, whether or not it's erotica depends on how the publisher is marketing it.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, a lot of the stuff that you've written for Metamor City is, not any more erotic than the stuff that I've published in it.
Well, to some extent, I'm trying to match your tone, but I mean, Dreams of Change didn't have a huge amount of sex in it.
What do you think is your biggest strength as a writer? I have an alpha reader. Her name's Anne Regentine. She used to be an erotica author. She stopped writing it a while back. She's currently working on a serial about a kind of an underground society of all the legendary immortals from all the different legends around the world. So, Comte de Saint Germain and Nicholas Flamel and the whole alchemist immortals thing, but there's also the Flying Dutchman and all these other people who are thought of as being immortal for one reason or another. So anyway, she's my alpha reader, and I send her everything pretty much as soon as I've written it to get an immediate reaction on. And she says, I love getting this stuff from you because every time I think you've completely exhausted something and written every weird thing there can be about it, you come up with something new. It's like Monster Whisperer, for example, has 7 different kinds of tentacle monsters in it. And they're all completely different from each other. And in the sequel that I'm writing now, I've created 4 more that are also completely different from the ones that came before. So I think my strength has got to be just thinking up the weirdest shit you've ever come across. I don't think that I write, dialogue or action or description or anything like that better than anyone else. Certainly people, I have to work really hard to get those things right. But yeah, I think imagination is my big strength. And what's a challenge that you're working on in your writing right now? Something that you're wrestling with, and what are you doing to overcome it?
Well, we already talked about the social justice stuff,
Hmm.
and I continue to work on better representation of marginal people and things like that. But I think I don't think that's a challenge that you ever say, well, okay, I've mastered that, right?
Right. That's not so much about craft as it is about just living in the world.
Right. So I think as far as craft is concerned, um, the thing I the thing that I mean, I've always had a trouble with getting the right ending.
Mm.
They say that there's three kinds of writers: the ones who have trouble with beginning, ones who have trouble in the middle, and the ones who have trouble at the end. Um, and I'm one of the ones who has troubles with endings. Anne is one of that small minority of people who has trouble with beginnings. She usually writes 4, 5, 6 different beginnings for something after she finished to go back and try to find a good one. I'm the same way with endings. I'm actually currently writing the ending of the serial that I've been running, just like Monster Whisperer did back then, is now for people on my Patreon. It's the kind of private serial just for the Patreon supporters. Patreon.com/Nobilis.
Ding.
Uh, which is a fantasy adventure romance involving really gigantic breasts and magic that allows you to make portals between different places. And it's called Bra of Holding. The first chapter of which is in my podcast, and all the other chapters of which are running monthly in my Patreon. And I'm currently writing the very last chapter. I'm a little bit ahead. That's chapter 20, and the podcast is, I think, on 9 or 10, which reminds me I need to get the next one out for December. Anyways, yeah, I have started this chapter like 6 times and then just erased everything I wrote and started again. Because the challenge of pulling together all the different threads that you have laid out in this course of a novel and doing it in a way that's elegant, does not seem contrived, does not seem rushed or forced or boring. Getting all that stuff to come together is as difficult as cooking a meal where all the different kinds of food are done at the same time.
Right.
And if you've been doing it as a serial, just like when you're cooking in the kitchen, you can't go back and change when things started. So you have to figure out how to make things work in the moment. And while I do have the advantage of being well ahead of where the serial is, I'm still locked as far as the chapters that I have released. And yeah, endings are the bane of my existence. I can write, and it's funny because I have a term for this, and I'll get to it in a moment, but I can write like 800 to 1,200 words a day up until I get to the ending, and then it goes to 400 and then 200 and then 100. And it's almost as if part of me doesn't want it to be over.
Right.
I call it, and the same thing happens to me when I'm reading, and I call it biblioterminophobia, the irrational fear of the endings of books. When I'm reading a book, and if it's an actual paper book, it's terrible this way. As I get to as the remaining bit to be read gets thinner and thinner and thinner, I get slower and slower at reading it, to the point where when it's close to the end, I might have it on my bedside table, pick it up, read a page, and just say, oh, no, okay, I'll put it down. And then a paragraph, and then just read the same paragraph a few times before moving on. And it's terrible. I waste so much time, which is why ebooks have been really great, is because I now don't see the end coming so
Right.
well. I turn off all the parts
of
the screen that tell me how far I'm through the book. And the book ends, and it's like, oh, wow, that was the ending. Okay, I feel that same sense of loss. I mean, you've seen that cartoon of someone just sitting on a curb, just their head in their hands, and saying, "What happened?" Is like, I finished the book.
There's
There's
no
that
more
drop.
pages left.
There's nothing left. There is that drop, especially if there's no sequel to pick up immediately. But at least I don't have the anticipation of it coming up. And audiobooks are even better, because then there's not even any real slowing down. It just goes along and then happens. So generally speaking, I've not been hit really hard by my biblioterminophobia lately, but nevertheless, I still have it. It's just that I've learned to live with it. Now I got to figure out a way to do that with books. I know. I will have the sequel outlined and say, okay, I'm just going to keep on writing, but that'll just be that could very well just be something that I write up to the end, over into the next book, and then stop. So that I don't need to worry, and it kind of trick my mind into getting me to the end quicker.
I've heard a lot of authors say that, actually, that, as soon as they finish one project, they immediately open a new document and start on the next thing before they ever walk away from the computer.
Yeah, I can see that. I can see the value in that. But I think in my particular case, what I might do is have the next chapter after the end, quote unquote, planned out, so that I can run over the end into that and then stop.
Yeah.
For that particular set of characters and settings and stuff. So
that's cool.
We'll see how that works.
What else are you up to? Your the Monster Whisperers coming out on December 8th. What else can we look forward to from in the coming year?
Well, Monster Whisperer is the ebook release is on December 8th. There's going to be a print version, which I'll be bringing to Balticon. There's going to be an audiobook version narrated by the same person who's narrating Brav Holding. This is Bliss Morgan. She is fabulous. And we're going to make an audible version of that, which will include the prequel short story, Birth of a Monster Whisperer, that I wrote after Monster Whisperer, and so it'll be a deluxe edition that includes some extra content compared to previous releases.
Nice.
And then I'm finishing Brav Holding. That's going to be running in the podcast. And after I finish writing that, which should be very soon, I hope, please finish soon. This is present me talking to future me. And I'm writing Monster Whisperer 2. I've got an outline for it. I've written 7 or 8, 9 chapters of that. I took a break to finish off Brav Holding when that turned out was going to be longer than just a few chapters. Of course, I've got episodes of the podcast coming out, something coming out every week right now. In between the short story, I have a serial running in the podcast called Capricious, which is an erotic romance set in the town of Fox Pass, Texas, which is a romance between a satyr and a thunderbird.
Huh.
But of course, in the grand tradition of that sort of underground supernatural story, they both have human forms that they walk around in most of the time. And right. Fox Pass has about half human and half supernaturals. And there's trolls and chupacabras and there's a nymph and elves and all kinds of different kinds of people. And I've been running that, and since it's from the satyr's point of view, I've been doing the narration on that myself. Since audiobooks is kind of not a thing, I mean, it's still there, but it hasn't got quite the attention that it used to get in the podcasting world. I'm not sure if we're going to collect it somewhere and put the whole thing somewhere. We might have a website where we can take just all the Capricious episodes in one place for people to just download and listen to. So that's what I'm working on right now, audio wise and writing wise. But my to be written folder has got just like 36 half-started novellas and novels. I have no idea which one of them would be when, but yeah, the Monster Whisperer 2 is high on the list. The world still has a lot more stories left to tell after this. So it might, I mean, if it does well, it might become the thing that I write, kind of like you did with Metamor City. I've this isn't the first multi-book world that I've done, but I think that I've got a better handle on world building and a better handle on setting things up for sequels than I did in the past. So I'm really hoping that this is successful enough to warrant the effort of going on to the next one.
Well, I wish you the best of luck. Thanks so much for coming on The Raven and the Writing Desk, Nobilis.
You are quite welcome.